Okay, everybody. Today in class, we are going to be talking about the interview process. So, interviewing is something that in journalism is super important because it is where we get all of our information. The interview essentially writes its own story, which you will find when we start drafting. So, pay attention to all these steps. Please pause the video to take notes. These are all very important, and conducting a good interview will just make your life so much easier in this class. So we're going to get into step one, which is thinking of secondary topics. By the time you're getting ready to interview, you should already have your story topic in your head. But in order to conduct the most effective interview possible, having some secondary ideas for where you want to go is super effective. This is where we get into the who's, what's, where's, when's, why's, how's, and so on and so forth. You really want to think of every possible angle you could go with this story, so that you can come up with the best, not only sources for your interview, but questions as well, both of which we'll be getting into later in the video. But the more brainstorming you do at this point for where you can run with this story, it will make your life so much easier when you're drafting. Always important to keep in mind. Next, we'll get into step two, which is choosing the best interviewees for your story. Obviously, everybody will have different interviewees because we're not all writing the same stories. But it's not even as simple as that. Sometimes the most obvious people aren't the ones who are best for your story. This is why coming up with subtopics is so important, because now you can think, oh, well, if I want to take that angle in my story, who are the best people for me to talk to? It's not always the most obvious people, be it friends or family of your main topic. It might be teachers or coaches or people you wouldn't think of. But that's why it's important to think of these subtopics so that it will help you with the interview as a whole and taking a specific angle on that. Next, we get into step three, which is coming up with not just coming up with questions, but coming up with effective interview questions. You could use the same list of questions for a handful of interviews, but coming up with one specific for that interview will make it so much better. You want to go back to those subtopics that you thought of earlier when thinking of these questions and think, okay, for this specific person I want to talk to, what are the best things for me to ask them? If you ask everybody the same questions, your story will probably be either pretty flat or pretty repetitive or both. And those are things we want to avoid in this class. So think of creative and out of the box questions that will help guide you towards the lens you want to take. And step four is reaching out to the interviewee. While this seems like a very simple thing to do, it tends to be one of the most stressful parts of the process for students, especially if their interviewee is not a friend or peer from class. Email is the best way to go about this, especially a lot of our sources will be administrators and staff members in the building. We know that they check their emails all the time, so that would be a great way to reach out to many of your sources. But for some, if you're writing about stories in regards to the town or small businesses, always feel free to go in and talk to somebody. Usually, when it comes to a high school paper, they'll be more than willing to help. But having that conversation, while it can be difficult, is super important to the process. And then step five, finally, we are conducting the actual interview. If that last step wasn't the most stressful for you, this one probably will be. Conducting the interview, while the most important part, because we'll write our story, can be very stressful. So we'll go over all the etiquette and things that we need to remember during the interview when we get back to class next time. However, I did want to point out that while conducting the interview, it's best to just remain calm, ask your questions, and don't be afraid to go off script. If they bring up an interesting point that you were not expecting, feel free to ask follow-up questions. The more information, the better, and it's only going to make your story stronger in the end of the day. So get everything you can from them, and once again, we'll go over more etiquette later. So once the interview's done, what do we do next? That's probably what you're all wondering. We'll get into that in a couple weeks into class, but that last step would be dramatic pause, drafting. So drafting is super easy once you've done a good interview because the interview, like I've said before, writes itself. So once you get all the information from that transcribed, you should have it all right there. Use a lot of copy and pasting, and you'll have a pretty solid draft as long as your interview went well. I hope you guys found these steps helpful, and we'll review it next time we meet in class. And I hope you all have a great night.